this is Dr. Kin, and I'm joined today by my teaching assistant Bear, who may come and go as she pleases, to give a lecture for the fake news module on the foundation year on the ancient Greek origins of fake news, or some of the origins of fake news. So this lecture is for, as I say, the fake news class, who will have the notes and slides. But in the great spirit of democratic Athens, anyone who wishes is free to watch this if they want to. So I will talk briefly about the concept of fake news, and then go through some examples. So I think probably, one good way to begin is in a manner akin to that of Socrates, the philosopher, who often asked, what is this thing? What is something that we take for granted that we think we know? And do we actually know what it is? Well, you will have talked about, or the class will have talked about, the concept of fake news. But I'm going to begin by asking, what is it? And at the most basic, fake news is just a lie, right? But it's a lie with a kind of specific purpose that's designed to get some effect, to impact people, to make, affect their decision making or something. So there are a number of ways that fake news can manifest. One is through the medium of rhetoric, which I'll be talking a bit more about in time to come. Rhetoric is the art of public speaking, the art of persuasive public speaking. More obviously, something like propaganda fits the bill of fake news rather well. And also mistakes. Sometimes people make mistakes, they relate the wrong information, and that's fake news, though it's not intentional, but it may have some impact. And finally, the term that's probably most applicable to the use of fake news in our world today is weaponized disinformation. Although, again, as we'll see, this is not new. This is lies or disinformation designed to produce a very specific, usually political effect. There are other definitions that we could come up with, but as I said, the purpose of this is to consider the ancient Greek origins. So in terms of the content, I'll go through, first of all, some mythological examples. There are quite a few. And in fact, I'll say that almost every mythology in the world has some kind of trickster character, from Loki in the Norse mythology to Coyote in the southwestern United States Native American traditions. For the Greeks, it's usually a man named Odysseus, who is descended from the gods, and is tricky, but considered a good example to follow. So I'll look at some mythological examples. It's not just Odysseus, but some others as well. I'll talk about the concept of sophistry and rhetoric, the use of persuasive speech, which the ancient Greeks developed into a fine art. I'll give some examples from the Spartans, who were no strangers to disinformation and its use politically. And I'll conclude on an example from the history of Alexander the Great, where potentially, arguably, a case of weaponized disinformation resulted in the loss of a city during wartime. But we'll begin with mythology, and why am I talking about mythology? Well, because for the Greeks, as well as for other cultures, mythology was often a source of examples of behavior, of the right and the wrong way to behave. And as I say, there are a number of myths where somebody is tricked, usually someone in authority is tricked, and it's sort of up to us to figure out what the moral of that might be. So the first example, and you'll be seeing stuff on your screen here, hopefully, that I'll talk about, has to do with the myth of Prometheus. And this is to be found in a 7th century BC writer named Hesiod's work called the Theogony, which means the origin of the gods. And it's just, the notes contain the full story, but it has to do with Prometheus tricking Zeus into accepting basically stuff for his sacrifice that humans don't want. So Prometheus has prepared two sort of packets one containing the good meat from the animal that people like to eat, the other containing the stuff they don't eat, like the bones and the and offal or whatever. But he's bound them up to look so that the stuff that people don't like looks better in its package. And Zeus picks that one for his sacrifice. When he realizes that he's been tricked and that the good stuff, all the good meat, is going to humans. And by the way, a sacrifice, an animal sacrifice in ancient Greece or Rome, was a bit like a barbecue. It was dedicated to a god, but then everybody would eat, whatever had been sacrificed. And this is the origin of that, or they believe the origin, where this god Prometheus or Titan has tricked Zeus into accepting, for the god's part, the stuff that humans don't want. Anyway, so out of revenge, we're told that Zeus hid fire from humankind, though Prometheus would steal it and bring it to them. He himself, Prometheus, would be punished by being chained to a mountaintop where a vulture or an eagle, depending on the version of the myth, will come and devour his liver every day. Being immortal, his liver regenerates, so it's like perpetual punishment. He'll be freed by Heracles at some point. But here we have one of for them it would have been religion, but a myth in which one god tricks another in favor of humankind. Zeus was tricked through an act of fake news. Look at these two things. One looks nicer than the other, but it wasn't the nicest of the two. How many times does this sort of happen today, where a product you might see flashed on your Instagram feed or whatever turns out to be something that isn't quite as good as advertised? It's that sort of thing. The other example. Another example that I'll talk about has to do with the Trojan horse, which most people have heard of, and I put in the notes, where we find this. It's talked about in the Odyssey, although the events took place in the war with Troy, which happened in the Iliad, and in it, Odysseus, the man who is skilled at contriving in many ways, we were told, and someone that was widely admired in antiquity, comes up with his strategy to defeat the Trojans. And here we have, a bit later, retrospectively, from the Odyssey, King Menelaus of Sparta recollecting these things. He says, "I have never seen such another man as Odysseus. What endurance, too, and what courage he displayed within the wooden horse, wherein all the bravest of the Greeks were lying in wait to bring death and destruction upon the Trojans." So the Trojan horse, is a fine example. He says the Trojans, the city was doomed when it took in that horse, within which were all the bravest of the Greeks waiting to bring death and destruction. So it's a case of the Greeks had been fighting. I put other examples in the notes if anyone wants to see. The Greeks have been fighting the Trojans for a long time, weren't making a lot of headway necessarily, so Odysseus comes up with a scheme: build a giant wooden horse to look like it's being offered as maybe a gift to the people. They worshipped Poseidon. Horses were associated with Poseidon, so it kind of makes sense. The Greek fleet then withdrew, and all the Greek soldiers withdrew from the battlefield. It looked like they had gone back home. They had just sailed around the coast. But there was the wooden horse with a bunch of Greeks inside, and the Trojans bring it into their citadel and have a great celebration. There's a debate. Should they bring it in? Is it a trick? Eventually, what wins out is no. It must be. The Greeks have given up and gone home. So after the party, everyone's asleep. Odysseus and his men get out of the horse, and trigger warning: they slaughter pretty much everyone in the city and take the women and children as mostly slaves. So here is an example, again from mythology, but where fake news, a trick, a lie, in effect, has sufficed to win a war. Again, it's mythical, but this is the sort of thing, we still talk about Trojans, like a Trojan virus, for example, today. The concept of the Trojan horse is very much with us, and we might look back and think, well, how in the world could those people have, fallen for something like that? But that was the first time it was done, if it was done. Again, it's just a story, but it's a story that has, that people will imitate, and in some sense is still with us. The other mythological example comes also from the Odyssey, and Odysseus is the chief figure here once again. And he's sailing back home, but because he's angered Poseidon, he's been cursed, and so he's going to wander for about 10 years before he can get back, and eventually all of his sailors will be lost. But before some of that happens, he and his men get captured by the Cyclops, this giant creature with one eye that is going to eat all the men. And I'll point out, by the way, that the myth of the Cyclops probably comes from ancient Greeks finding woolly mammoth skulls. The way, as I understand, the way the skull looks, there's kind of a sort of hole in the middle that looks like it might have been an eye socket. It isn't, but you know, or other bones of megalithic fauna that no longer exist, and they assume these must be giant one-eyed creatures. But that aside, in the story, Odysseus tricks the Cyclops, and I'm not going to go through the whole myth, but he tricks the Cyclops by getting him drunk and blinding him. But then he tells him, when he escapes with his men and steals the Cyclops' sheep and some other things, the Cyclops demands to know, who is this? Who has done this to me? And he says, Cyclops, you ask my name, and I will tell it to you. Give me, therefore, the present you promised. My name is No Man. This is what my father and mother and my friends have always called me. Nemo in Greek, Nemo, No Man. And so when the Cyclops realizes he's been tricked, he shouts out, "No man has done this to me." When his neighbors, the other Cyclopses, ask, and what in the world? You must be sick. But it suffices. There are several. If you go through the story, you'll see several examples of where Odysseus has lied to, used fake news to trick the Cyclops. His men escape by hiding under the large sheep that the Cyclops has. Though he's been blinded at that point, he checks them with his hands as they go out, and because the men are underneath, he doesn't spot them. As I say, mythology is full of many such examples. We could talk about others from the Greeks. We could talk about others from other mythological traditions. We'd be here all day, and maybe even longer, because there are so many. The trickster figure, as I say, figures prominently into a number of religions and mythologies around the world, and usually in some positive way. So the idea, or in a sense, that people would like to imitate them. People wanted to be like Odysseus, to be clever like Odysseus. And that meant lying. The whole of the Odyssey really is him tricking people by lying to them rather successfully. We're told that a goddess whispers into his ear to give him these clever lies. So, at the earliest, and these myths, they date back to the Bronze Age in some respects. So we're talking, to 1000 BC or so, or even earlier, where these are coming from. So I say, the Greeks, they're not the origin of fake news. They're the kind of first ones to write it down that we know of, probably. But as long as there have been governments lying to their people, parents lying to children for whatever reasons, there has been some form of fake news. And as I say, the Greek mythology in particular provides some really good examples of this. So moving out of the mythological... Oh, I forgot one more. There's one more I almost forgot from mythology. It's the case, and this is an accident, but it's the case of Theseus and the Black Sail. Theseus famously slew the Minotaur on Crete, and I won't go through the entire story again. The notes contain it, but Athens was subject to the Cretan Empire in this mythological time, mytho-history we might call it. And for a slight done against them, the king of Crete demanded an annual sacrifice of, I believe it was 7 young men and 7 young women from Athens to be sacrificed to this half-man, half-bull monster in the labyrinth. So the king's son, Theseus, has grown up at this point. He's something of a hero. He fights monsters elsewhere. He wants to put an end to this. So he goes with the 7 or the 14 youths to be sacrificed, but he's planning to find a way to defeat the Minotaur. And he tells his father, if I'm successful, because the ship that sailed to Crete with these people on it had black sails, because it was, this was a sad occasion, and the sails reflected. It's like a letter edged in black. We still have that tradition today. And Theseus says to his father, King Aegeus, he says, if I'm successful, I'll change the sails on the ship to white when I return. That way you'll know that I've been successful in my mission. And long story short, with the help of a goddess and the princess royal of the Cretan royal family, he's able to defeat the Minotaur, partly through trickery as well, as it turns out, also with the help of a goddess. And unfortunately, on the way back, they were so joyful, him having defeated the Minotaur and rescued the youths, and this would be an end to these sacrifices, they forgot to change the sails on the ship. And we're told that King Aegeus, who's seeing the black sail far off, being out of all hope evermore to see his son again, took such a grief at his heart that he threw himself headlong from the top of a cliff and killed himself. He threw himself into the sea, and that bit of the sea where he sacrificed himself essentially is called the Aegean, from King Aegeus or Aegeus. Again, a lot of Greek myths explain the origin of things through stories like this. This is probably not how the Aegean got its name exactly, but we don't know. So this is a case of fake news, that is to say, the king seeing from a distance the black sails on the ship being a mistake. It was an error. Somebody forgot to change the sails, but that, as far as the king was concerned, the news was his son and the others were lost. So it had a real impact, in the story at least, on this man's life. As I say, there are many other examples from mythology, and I won't go through them all. But I'll move on now to talk about classical rhetoric and the art of deception, or arts of deception. Now, in Greece, in ancient Greece, in the 5th and 4th centuries, we count backwards in BC, by the way, so 5th and 4th centuries BC, the art of rhetoric was developed to the level of a science, really. And the experts in this subject were called sophists. Sophistai in Greek. It means the wise ones. In fact, it means pretty much the same thing as philosopher. Philosopher means lover of wisdom. Sophist means wise person. The distinction between sophist and philosopher is not quite as great as some people would imagine. But anyway, a number of teachers or professors went around charging fees to teach rhetoric. And in cities, especially like Athens, which was a democracy, rhetoric was in high demand. You can imagine educated elites wanted to, learn these skills to give them an advantage in the assembly or the courts. In democratic states, persuasive speech was very, very, very popular subject to learn for those people who could afford it. And the practitioners of this made a special study of what we would call human psychology. Aristotle writes in his Poetics a number of things about it, but then we have the sophists themselves. Note that the success of most of these rhetorical, and they develop a series of rhetorical tricks, we call them, which are ultimately fake news of some kind. The success of these ultimately depends on the inclination on the part of some people to believe the lies being perpetuated for whatever reason. So a clever public speaker will be aware of people's prejudices, their interests, their inclinations, and pattern or shape the speech to that end. And so what they discovered is that the non-logical types of persuasive speech, or allogistic is the Greek term, non-logical, were more effective because most people aren't very logical. And this is something that politicians today are very much aware of, as well as marketing gurus and the media. Most people don't think logically. They think emotionally, they are moved by their emotions. So a lot of rhetoric and persuasive speech is designed to appeal to people's emotions. And I put a long list of them with their Latin names in the notes. I'll just go through a couple. One kind is called the ad populum argument, or an argument that appeals to the people. And this is what we would call demagoguery or populist type speech. So often these are based on like national or nationalistic perspectives, instincts, stereotypes, that sort of thing. The speaker tries to acquire ground, as it were, for their thesis, often, identifying what people dislike, um, or something that and what people dislike often is disturbing the status quo. So they'll pick out examples of this, and highlight them. Um, yeah, I put examples in the notes, and others. I won't go through them all. One popular one is the ad numerum uh, argument, and this is really a kind of logical mistake. Uh, and it occurs whenever someone claims legitimacy for whatever position they're arguing based on the number of people who believe in it, which you should be aware, just because a lot of people believe something is true does not make it true. But again, if the speaker knows that people believe something, whatever it is, or they've got a prejudice or a bias, that can be exploited. Um, the absurd argument based on absurdity, is one where people will argue that by accepting one position, you're accepting another. That's not necessarily connected to it. One that was used in the U.S., especially, but perhaps elsewhere, would be, and I'm quoting, I'm not saying I believe this, but the example is that by accepting homosexuals, giving them equal rights, people will soon start accepting pedophiles and necrophiles, or bestiality, or something. Connecting up things that are not connected. That there is no indication that homosexuality is connected to pedophilia or necrophilia. This is not backed by scientific evidence, but people might believe it, and because of that, again, a clever speaker can use it to their advantage. Probably the types that you're most familiar with would be like the ad hominem or the ad personam argument, and this is where a speaker will attack another person, either another person's views, not related to whatever is being talked about necessarily, or just something about them, calling them an idiot, referring to Sleepy Joe Biden, or Hillary Clinton, something like that. So just a name calling. It doesn't have any basis in logic, but it can set the audience against that person. And this can even be done non-verbally. So think, there's an example from, if someone can cast their mind back to the Hillary Clinton and Trump debates that were televised, where he walks around her menacingly while she talks, while she's giving her responses. That could be taken as an ad hominem, an attack against the person, or the individual in this case, and it was effective. One final example, and as I say, they did develop this to a fine art, but one sort of final example that I'll talk about is the moral equivalence argument, and this is widely deployed by public speakers today, as it was back in ancient times. And it's the idea that, an example would be that I've suffered, you should suffer too, that kind of thing. I had to go through this, why shouldn't you? Or oh, you're going on strike because your wages are too low and your workload's too high. Well, look at these nurses. They're in a much worse condition than, say, university lecturers. Shouldn't you just accept your lot in life and pity them or something? Well, it doesn't matter. These are two separate things. Suffering is wrong, right? We agree suffering is wrong. Just because someone else has suffered doesn't mean you should suffer. But the moral equivalence argument, the idea that two things that are not even necessarily related are somehow equivalent or has some bearing on each other, that one is another example of a non-logical argument widely used. And all of these things amount to some kind of fake news. We don't have a lot of examples from the actual sophists of ancient Greece that survive. Mostly what we have are Roman versions that were, copied or adapted from the Greek originals. We do have one source, from the sophist, and that's Gorgias, which I put in the reading for the seminar for this. Gorgias was considered one of the greatest sophists of all time. He's been, I think, falsely attributed to the quote that, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. I don't know that he actually said that, but he certainly lived it. He even seems to have thought, seemingly based on what he wrote, that words, lies, in effect, have the power to change reality itself. Now, this is not as strange as it may sound. There is a concept today you'll find in the, particularly among the neoconservative groups in the U.S. that we sometimes refer to as wagging the dog. And this is where something that hasn't happened is sort of talked up as if it were happening, and it can develop enough impetus, enough force behind it, or belief that it actually does happen. Wars have arguably been started this way. Gorgias was a great believer in this sort of thing. He's most famous for his defense of Helen. Not that Helen actually needed a lot of defending, because in the stories about her, she's taken from Troy, or sorry, from Sparta to Troy, and this is back to mythology again, but she's taken from Sparta to Troy because the gods have intervened. But in the popular mindset, Helen is a villain. She's this loose woman who, because she made these men fall in love with her, it's clearly her fault. In the popular mindset, she was guilty of having started the war. And Gorgias goes through and defends her in his famous encomium, which means poem in praise of, or song in praise of, Helen. And he says he gives several reasons why she's innocent. He says, first of all, well, if she actually loved him, love is really powerful, and it even affects the gods. So we can't blame her if she fell in love with Paris, or Alexandros of Troy. If it was the gods doing, again, that's not her fault. She had no control over that, and that is kind of the official version from the mythology. He also says that if Alexandros, or Paris of Troy, as he's called, persuaded her with rhetoric, then even then we can't blame her, because he says that words are like drugs on the mind. They have the effect on the mind as drugs have on the body. Plato would pick up this notion as well in his condemnation of the sophists, but he also seems to have thought that words could have an effect like drugs. Now, think about that, because it's not entirely untrue. If you are listening to some rousing rhetoric by a public speaker, who's very plugged into what his audience or her audience is feeling or thinking, people's moods can be changed. Their feelings can be changed. They can become angry. They can become ecstatic. They can go through a whole range of emotions, which arguably, in the mind, when we talk about things like serotonin and dopamine, it's the effect of a drug. Watch, a rally from Nazi Germany. And Gorgias is saying this, that a clever speaker can sort of play a person's mind like a musical instrument if they know what they're doing. So, as I say, the ancient Greeks developed this to a fine art. We still use these techniques today. We have actually improved upon them, but the basis of most modern propaganda, rhetorical speaking, that sort of thing, derives from the ancient Greeks. And in that sense, I'm going to move on to an example of propaganda, famously to do with the Spartans. And virtually everyone knows about the 300 at the Battle of Thermopylae, these brave Spartans who sacrificed themselves holding off the Persian invasion of Greece. This was in 480 BC. It's recorded in Herodotus's histories. Herodotus is one of the first historians. And you've probably seen the films, or at least one of the films. There have been several in modern times made about this. The 300 is the most, I think, recent one. And your impression of the Spartans is probably shaped in no small part by this story. But it is largely just a story, or at least it's a story that only 300 Spartans were there. We don't know precisely how many people were there, but there were a couple of thousand at least, maybe around 10,000 initially. Now, the king of Sparta, Leonidas, and his bodyguard, the 300 Spartans were the king's bodyguard. Just so you know, they stay behind when he dismisses some of the others. He also brought those Thebans who were counted among the number of those of whose general was, he names the general. So a number of Thebans are present, and the people from around Thebes as well. So it's not just 300 Spartans, and as I say, there are a number of allies. We're told that, let's see, after 4 days, he let some of them go home. It was clear that their position was going to be overrun. And again, I put this in the notes for anyone who wants to look at it. It's said that Leonidas himself sent them all away because he was concerned they would be killed, but he felt it not fitting for himself and the Spartans to desert that post which they had come to defend at the beginning. So he sent away a number of people, except for some of the Boeotians, and apparently the excuse is that he doesn't trust them. He thinks they're going to join the enemy, so he makes them stay. Considering this and wishing to win distinction for the Spartans alone, he sent away the allies rather than have them leave in disorder because of the attack. And yeah, so in the end, it's not just 300 Spartans, and I put up on the slide the monument which recognizes some of the other peoples who were there. We get a description of the place. The hill is at the mouth of the pass where the stone lion in honor of Leonidas now stands. In that place they defended themselves with swords if they still had them, and with hands and teeth. The barbarians, that's the Persians, buried them with missiles, some arrows, some attacking javelins, some attacking from the front and throwing down the defensive wall, others surrounding them on all sides. So the monument that was erected there says here 4,000 from the Peloponnese once fought 3 million. So those figures are probably wrong. We reckon around closer to 10,000 Greeks initially fought the Persians, and the Persian numbers were not 3 million, they were closer to perhaps 250,000. Still, the Greeks were heavily outnumbered. But for whatever reasons, we remember 300 Spartans. Not the 4,000 some odd or however many that were actually that were mown down by the Persians. We think 300 Spartans, and that affects how we think of the Spartans. And the Spartans, as it turns out, are no strangers to promoting a certain image of themselves. So suffice it to say, the Spartans would be very happy with the kind of image that the 300 portrays. It's not historically accurate. It is propagandistic. It makes the Spartans seem a lot tougher than they were. Don't get me wrong, they were some of the best soldiers in antiquity, but they seem to have tightly managed their image abroad. They were a very closed society and could control what news about them got out, and some of that news was most assuredly fake. So the 300, I don't know if the Spartans intended the 300 who died at Thermopylae to be, used propagandistically. They certainly made great capital of it later on. But another example, I have another example from the Spartans of fake news that seems to be designed to promote their, again, how foreigners, how outsiders viewed them. And this is the notion of eugenics and infanticide. So do we know eugenics? If we don't, it literally means good offspring or good birth, but it has to do with some kind of policy or scientific or pseudoscientific approach to breeding people, really, before the age of genetic manipulation. The Nazis, again, had some kind of version of this. They weren't the only ones in the 20th century. But it looks like the Spartans may have had something similar, although it's very hard to evidence. So they were alleged to have practiced like a selective infanticide, meaning that when a child was born, I think it had to be a certain age, but not long after it was born, It would be taken before the city elders. They would examine it. If it was considered weakly or disabled, it was thought that, or we were told, this is from Plutarch, a writer who did a biography of a Spartan king named Lycurgus, or a lawgiver named Lycurgus, that they would throw it down a pit. If it was considered unworthy, it would be cast into a pit. This is what Plutarch writes. He says, offspring was not reared at the will of the father, but was taken and carried by him to a place called Lesche, where the elders of the tribes officially examined the infant. And if it was well built and sturdy, they ordered the father to rear it, and assigned it one of the 9,000 lots of land. But if it was ill-born and deformed or disabled, they sent it to the so-called apothetai, a chasm-like place at the foot of Mount Taygetus, in the conviction that the life of which nature had not well equipped at the very beginning for health and strength was of no advantage either to itself or the state. In Sparta, citizens belonged to the state first and foremost, and this is what Lycurgus, this is what Plutarch records. And I've gone through some other examples contemporary with the Spartans themselves, but first of all, it's worth pointing out Plutarch never knew the Spartans of the 5th and 4th century BC. Plutarch's writing in about the 2nd century AD, and he's, some nearly, 500, 600 years later. He's got sources that we don't have, but I'm not sure what his source is on this, because no contemporary source, contemporary with the Spartans that he's talking about, mention this. Plato discusses the potential for doing something like it, but doesn't actually say that anyone does it. Aristotle talks about the concept of eugenics. I put these in the notes, but he doesn't say that any of them are practiced. But we do have a Hippocratic corpus. These are medical texts from this same era, from the 5th to 4th century, and it talks about people who are born with congenital conditions, and how to accommodate them. So yeah, that's interesting. Now, in the case of the actual Spartans themselves, first of all, archaeology has been done on the site where these infants were said to have been cast, this pit they were to be cast into. There are no infant skeletons in it. There are adult skeletons, which leads people to think that probably this was where the Spartans executed criminals, but no infants. So there's no evidence of mass infanticide in Sparta. What's more, we have examples from other sources contemporary with the Spartans at the time, not written much later, like Plutarch, that suggest that when someone was born with what we would call a disability, the Spartan society accommodated them. Even one of their kings, and the kings were meant to be subject to the same rule as everyone else concerning such matters. There are records of disabled kings and other individuals who are not kings, who are disabled, but who were accommodated by Spartan society. So it's an example of fake news that this historian, or he's a philosopher actually, Plutarch, has recorded. Where it comes from, we're not sure, but somebody wanted people to believe that the Spartans were doing this to children, and that they were that serious about their society, and everyone being fit and healthy in it, that they killed off all these children. But it doesn't look like they actually did. Example of fake news being used as propaganda. There are many examples with the Spartans. Plutarch records a number of sayings of the Spartans, where the woman famously sends her son off to war, saying, "You come back with your shield or on it," meaning either don't if you throw away your shield in battle, you're a coward. So you bring your shield back, or you're carried on it, either wounded or dead. Did a Spartan mother actually say this to her son? Who knows? But it's the sort of thing that the Spartans like people to believe about them. There's another story about a Spartan boy who stole a fox. They weren't supposed to steal, obviously, but Spartan youths weren't fed enough, and they were expected to steal to accommodate, to feed themselves, but not to get caught, because getting caught got you punished. So a Spartan boy steals a fox, he knocks it unconscious, he's carrying it under his cloak. Someone stops him, says, "Did you steal a fox?" And the boy vehemently denies it. But while he's being interrogated, the fox wakes up and starts gnawing at his entrails, and the boy will die as a result. But he never lets on that he's being chewed up alive while he's denying having stolen the fox. Again, did that really happen? I don't know. It's a good story. It's a fun story, or fun. It's a disturbing story, in fact. But it's the kind of thing the Spartans want people to believe. I have no evidence that it happened. There are lots of sayings of the Spartans like this, some of which are probably true, some of which aren't. So I'm going to conclude on an example of fake news, potentially. I'll explain why I say potentially in a moment, but an example of fake news being used in warfare. This is in the 4th century BC, during the time of Alexander the Great. So this has to do with the defeat of Thebes, which happens in around 335 BC. What's happened is that Philip II of Macedon, has been assassinated. This is Alexander's father, and Alexander is now king of Macedon. He is about to go and fight the Persian Empire, but before he does that, he has to put down a number of revolts. Initially, he's on the north shore of the Danube, fighting some of they'd be called barbarians at the time, but people who were subject to the kingdom of Macedon, who take the opportunity of Philip's death to revolt. Alexander goes to fight them. While he's up there fighting, we're told, and it comes from a source named Arrian, or Lucius Flavius Arrianus Xenophon, a writer of the late first, early second century AD. Again, contemporary with Plutarch, using sources that are known to us. I have no reason to doubt his version of events here, but I'll come back to that in a minute. We're told, so Thebes, all of Greece was subject to Macedon at this point through something called the League of Corinth. Philip had established. All the southern Greek states had sworn an oath of loyalty to the kingdom of Macedon. When Philip dies, obviously there are old grievances, and some people who had been exiled from Thebes, which had been the superpower that Macedon most recently defeated. Thebes kind of replaces Athens and Sparta in the 4th century. These people who were exiles, who apparently were enemies of the kingdom of Macedon, they take advantage of the fact that Alexander's off fighting in the north to go into the Theban assembly, and this is what Arrian writes. Entering the public assembly, they incited the Thebans to revolt from Alexander, holding out to them as pretext the ancient and glorious words, liberty and freedom of speech, and urging them now at last to rid themselves of the heavy yoke of the Macedonians. By stoutly maintaining that Alexander had been killed in Illyria, they gained more power in persuading the multitude, for this report was prevalent, and for many reasons it gained credit, both because he had been absent a long time and because no news had arrived from him. Accordingly, as is usual in such cases, not knowing the facts, each man conjectured what was most pleasing to himself. So this is Arrian, the historian, giving us a superb example of how fake news works. Alexander was not dead, but some people wanted to believe that he was. It's the kind of the ad numerum argument. People want to believe this, so or the ad auditorium argument, where people want to believe something and a speaker takes advantage. So these speakers, if the story is true, convince Thebes to revolt. And, well, as it happens, of course, Alexander is not dead. He hears about this, and he makes a very swift march from the north shore of the Danube to Thebes itself, and gets there in under a week. This is one of Alexander's, I think, great advantages as a leader. He was able to mobilize his forces rapidly. He did this by making them carry more stuff and reducing the size of the baggage train. Anyway, so he marches to Thebes. Even while he's there, and he says, right, you Thebans need to surrender, otherwise I'm going to destroy you. They don't believe him. They think it must be another Alexander. This is what Arrian writes. Um, Even then, the authors of the revolt asserted that the army had arrived out of Macedonia led by Antipater, who was one of Alexander's generals. And being very angry with those who announced that it was Alexander himself, they were saying, it must be another Alexander. You know, there were a lot of people in Macedonia named Alexander. It was a popular name. It must be another Alexander. The real one's dead. And it still holds, even though Alexander is present with his army demanding that they surrender, the people of Thebes remain, at least for a time, convinced that he's dead. We're told the next day he took the whole of his army and marched round towards the gate, which led to Attica. But not even then did he assault the wall itself, but encamped not far away from the citadel in order that he might offer them an olive branch, essentially. So Alexander doesn't really want to destroy Thebes. He offers them repeated instances of, opportunities to surrender. And this is what he writes. Arrian writes, then those of the Thebans who knew what was for the best interest of the commonwealth were eager to go out to Alexander and obtain pardon for the commonalty of Thebes for their revolt, but the exiles and those who had summoned them home kept on inciting the populace to war by every means in their power, since they despaired of obtaining for themselves any indulgence from Alexander, especially as some of them were also leaders who had been exiled by Alexander, or by Philip. However, not even for this did Alexander assault the city. Time and again, we're told he offered them opportunity to surrender, but so strong seemingly was the belief in the fact that he had died that Thebes was willing to risk its own destruction. And Alexander was successful in his destruction of Thebes. He is aided by some of his allies. Interestingly, some of those allies were ones who had a grievance against Thebes. So this is what, again, Arrian writes. The settlement of Theban affairs was entrusted by Alexander to the allies who had taken part in the action. They resolved to occupy the citadel with a garrison, but to raze the city to the ground, to distribute among themselves all the territory except that which was dedicated to the gods, and to sell into slavery the women and children, and as many of the males as survived, except those who were priests and priestesses, and those who were bound to Philip or Alexander by ties of hospitality. Pardon me. It is said that Alexander preserved the house of the descendants of the poet Pindar, etc. So the upshot is the result of these lies, of a lie, essentially, in this version of events, is that a city was destroyed. It was a city that didn't have to be destroyed. But based on this fake news. Now, there's another dimension to this. I mentioned that the story comes from Arrian, Lucius Flavius Arrianus Xenophon. He is one of several Alexander historians that we use today, and there are two or three main other ones, including Plutarch. None of the others mention anything about Alexander being dead, or people telling people that Alexander was dead. Now, they do mention some other interesting things, which may or may not serve to justify the destruction of Thebes, but that's interesting. So, is Arrian either lying? Is it fake news? And why? If that's so, why? I mean, we know that in Arrian's description of the battle, he says that one of Alexander's generals, a man named Perdiccas, without orders started the attack, and that led Alexander to have to continue the attack. He wasn't intending to attack at that point. His general acted independently and precipitated the attack. Arrian is the only version that says this. The others all say that Alexander ordered the assault himself and that this general didn't disobey orders. And there are reasons, we think, why Arrian's source reported that this general disobeyed orders, and they have to do with political events that came later. That probably is a lie. But what Arrian is trying to do is exonerate Alexander from what some saw as the crime of the destruction of Thebes. Alexander had destroyed multiple city-states to the north of the barbarians, of the non-Greeks. Hardly anyone in Greece cared because they weren't Greeks. But Thebes was not just a Greek city, but a preeminent Greek city, and this punishment that was delivered to it went down very badly for the rest of Greece. However, it did prevent, arguably, any other Greek cities from or states from rebelling. They don't, while apart from Sparta, but they weren't part of the League. Anyway, those that are part of the League, subject to Macedon, don't revolt until after Alexander is actually dead. We're told he regretted the destruction of Thebes, and I don't know if Arrian's account is truthful or not in that someone said that Alexander had died. I'm inclined to think it is true, but I don't know. So even on that I have to conclude on a note of uncertainty there, because it is possible that Arrian is himself using fake news to cast Alexander in a more positive light. And that's unfortunately the nature of Alexander the Great's scholarship generally. But let us say that Arrian is telling the truth, and that this lie was used to rally a city, to revolt, and resulted in its largely wholesale destruction. That's an example of what fake news can do in a real situation, in a warfare type situation. So I'll conclude there. Thank you for your attention. I hope you found this useful. As I say, the Greeks did not invent fake news, but they gave us a kind of scientific approach to it that we still use today. And it's useful to learn these things, to not just because it's interesting trivia about the ancient Greeks. These techniques, or more modern versions of them, but still basically the same techniques, are used against you every single day. They occur through the various media to which we are constantly exposed, through television, even the old print media. Fake news of some kind or another, in some form, designed to affect you. And if you know about it, that is at least the first step in perhaps avoiding it or not falling prey to it. Unfortunately, the sort of people who need to learn this are not watching this video or sitting in the classroom today. But I hope you all gain something from it. Thank you very much for your attention. My teaching assistant is now sleeping under my desk, so we'll send her goodbyes indirectly. But thank you, and I'll look forward to talking to you again soon. Bye for now.